Hi everyone, I'm Professor Carson, and if you're taking the Foundational Communication course at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, that's going to be either your Fundamentals of Oral Communications or your Interpersonal Communications course. This is a document that you should be very familiar with, and that's whether you've already done your outline or you're working on your first outline. This is going to be your template for how to get started. So that's what this is. This is your speech outline template, and it's a template for how you are supposed to write your outline as you get ready for your speech. And just to be clear, this template you are required to use in order to submit your outline, and you're required to follow the instructions that are in it. And while it does provide some instructions for, like at the very beginning, there's instructions here. For each section of the outline, there are instructions in yellow on how to write that specific part of the outline. I'm hoping this video provides a little bit more explanation and even provides an example of how you might want to use the template. But that's the purpose of this video. I'm not going to go over all of the details of how to write your outline, how to write your speech. That's what your textbook is for. That's what your lectures are for. I'm just hoping to provide a little bit of insight in what the template is for, how I grade the template as a professor, and the other thing I'm doing, I've actually written a speech using this template, and kind of just to show you an example of how someone might use this template. You don't have to do it actually, please don't do the exact same speech I did, because as you'll see in a second, it doesn't make sense. But I've made an example of a speech. You can read it during this video and see how I've written the speech using the template and using all of the different areas of the speech, like your introduction, your conclusion. And at the very end of this video, I'm actually going to give the speech while scrolling through the template. So you can kind of see what does an outline look like when it's completed and when someone is finished writing a speech outline, and then how does that compare to actually giving the speech when everything is done. So that's what we're going over today. And yeah, let's get started. Let me first real quick go over what is the purpose of an outline. And when it really comes down to it, the outline is meant to help you organize all of the information in your speech. Because as you can imagine, if you pick a speech topic, there's probably 1,000 different ways that you can write the speech and 1,000 different pieces of information that you could put into your speech. But when you've only got 5 to 7 minutes to give a speech, you have to narrow all of that down and make a lot of choices into what's the most effective way to give this speech. And so the template that we're giving you helps you do that. You pick a speech topic, you write a thesis statement or a purpose statement that defines why you're giving the speech, and then you narrow down all the information you have on that thesis into 3 main points. 3 main ideas that each in their own way support that thesis, that purpose statement that you are guiding your speech with. And each of those main points need to be supported by examples, by an explanation that explains why certain examples support that main point. And when all that is done, you then have to fill everything else in order to clearly communicate it. So even if you have all of the information in and it's organized and it makes sense, then we input all of the other stuff, from your transition statements to your attention getter to your summaries, that all work to make sure that even though you have all of your information, even though all that information supports your purpose statement, we now need to make sure that everything around that information helps clearly show the audience what you're talking about and why it's relevant to your purpose statement. And so that's what we're doing today. We are organizing all of the information you have about a speech topic into 3 main points, and then we're filling in all of the supplemental things that you'll say in order to make it clear to your audience what you're saying and why you're saying it. So let's get into it. I'm going to be jumping around a little bit, so please bear with me. But also keep in mind that when you have this template open, you have all the instructions up here that give you, some suggestions on how to do it. You have the textbook. I think chapter 8 is what covers a lot of the outlining stuff, but certainly the rest of the chapters will go over introductions and conclusions and writing body paragraphs. So you have your textbook, you have your lectures, you have your instructions, and then even within each of these, they have instructions here for each individual part of this template as well. So you have a lot of information here. I'm hoping my video is giving you a bit of a map on where to get started and provide an example on how to use it, but you certainly have a lot of other resources as well as you're trying to figure out, maybe if you're doing your first outline template or if you're refining your process as you work on your second or third speech. Hopefully you have a lot of resources available to help you with that. And not only that, but also at the very end of this, I'll just zoom in real quick, at the very end of this tips and suggestions page, you have the communication center. So if you want help with writing your outline, you have the comm center, you have the writing center, and so plenty of resources to help you out with this, as well as your professor if you reach out. Definitely don't feel like you are stuck by yourself trying to figure this out. But enough talking, let me get started. Like I just said, the place I would recommend starting with is your thesis statement, because that is the why behind your speech. And so what I've done for this speech, and this is why it's very difficult to steal this speech from me, is because I'm talking about the benefits of growing up in my hometown. And I hope that none of you choose this speech topic, unless you also grew up in Castro Valley, which I would love to talk to you about it. But anyways, that's the thesis of my speech. I am going to share the benefits of growing up in a town like Castro Valley. Now, from that, I've summarized my main points here, but you really should be starting in the body section once you have your thesis statement down. And what I've set as my 3 main points are: Castro Valley is a small suburban area that is governed. This is basically just background information about what Castro Valley is. My second main point is that the services offered in Castro Valley make it a great place to grow up. And the third main point I have is that the safe environment of Castro Valley makes it beneficial for children to develop cognitive skills. And I'm not going to go into too much detail onto how I developed those main points, but what it really came down to is I did a bunch of research and I tried to find sources that were relevant to Castro Valley, and some of them were. So I had the Census Bureau information on Castro Valley, which technically is a reliable source. It's not a scholarly source, but I do have 3 scholarly sources here. I looked at an article on the transit system in Castro Valley and how residents of Castro Valley use the transit system, and so that's one article I have. I have an article on the library system in Castro Valley, and this one librarian is talking about how to use volunteers in your library system. And then up here I have another scholarly source on how the design of pedestrian infrastructure supports cognitive development. And so really from those 3 scholarly sources is where I formed what my main points are going to be. I let the sources that I have and the information I had available dictate how I was going to write the speech. And so, like I said, my first main point, basic information about Castro Valley. The census information is perfect for that. The California Tourism website, perfect for that. Just basic information, doesn't need to be scholarly, doesn't need to be super detailed. That's all I need for that. Main point number 2, what services are offered? Well, I have this article about the libraries. I have this, I have this article about the transit system, and they're both specifically relevant to Castro Valley. So perfect. I have something for my second main point, which is the services of Castro Valley. And then I have this article about how infrastructure supports cognitive development, and that's perfect because cognitive development of children and supporting that goes directly with my thesis of why it's a great place to grow up. And so I made my third main point all about that, about how the infrastructure in Castro Valley, similarly to the way this article describes infrastructure, is great for cognitive development. And so that's how I made those 3 main points. Now, your main point, the way you write it, like it says here, it should be a single sentence. It should be a clear statement of what information you're giving in this speech. And as you'll notice at the end of this video, I'm not going to be reading this word for word as much. This is more to help me remember what is the main point of this part of my speech. And that can be helpful for you as you're practicing your speech, or as you are maybe practicing, what examples to give. It keeps you on track and makes sure that this statement can really help you stay accountable and making sure that you're only talking about this one part of your speech and you're not jumping to things like your second or third main point when you really should be focusing on this one. And the only way you can do that is if it's a very clear statement of what you're talking about. I'm not gonna use that one as an example. Let's start with number 2, because this one's just basic information, so that's an easy one to write about. But here's main point number 2. The services offered in Castro Valley make it a safe yet adventurous place to live, with easy access to public transportation and educational services. That is a very clear statement. I am very clearly saying that I'm talking about the services and I'm talking about how they make Castro Valley a safe place to live. I guess that is kind of redundant that I mentioned services twice, but that's what this main point is about. And so everything I say in my explanation and my example should talk about services and how they make it safe and adventurous. And you'll see that in this explanation. I have this little bit here which talks about my personal experience, which certainly you can use your own personal experience as a source in your speech. Just make sure you're doing the required number of scholarly sources. But yeah, I have a piece of information here explaining my personal experience using the transit system. And then I have my Yemen Cedar article, which talks about the transit system in Castro Valley. And then I have my library article, which talks about the library services in Castro Valley. And as you can see, all of this stuff directly talks about what services are offered in Castro Valley and how do they make it safe and adventurous. Third main point, very similar. Castro Valley's safe environment is beneficial for children to develop cognitive skills. And so I talk about my personal experience in what infrastructure is available in Castro Valley, and I mentioned that I believe that it made it very safe. And then I bring up the Bruce Appleyard article, which talks about what types of infrastructure are beneficial for children's progression for spatial knowledge. And by connecting my experience with what infrastructure is there and how that specific type of infrastructure makes it good for cognitive development, I've then argued for my main point that Castro Valley's safe environment is beneficial for children to develop cognitive skills. And so that's really what you're looking for when you're writing your main points. Your main point is one sentence that clearly says what are you trying to say in the 2 to 3 minutes that you're talking about that main point. Your explanation example is everything that supports that one sentence at the very top that you are talking about for that section of your speech. So, like I said, once you have all that done, the rest of it is filling in the filler. How do we, if I just go and I talk about Castro Valley is safe, here's the reasons why, thanks for listening, that is not really going to be effective at maintaining your audience's attention and helping them focus on what you're talking about. And so that's what all of the rest of this is for. We have our transition statements, which helps you transition from the previous point into the next point. And there's a few reasons we do that, which is all covered in your textbook as well. But we do this so that we, number one, signal to the audience that we're moving from one point to another, and that helps them mentally try to remember any key points from that previous main point and then get ready to receive new information about the next main point. It also helps to give them kind of a signpost for, like, imagine that your speech is a map and your audience is trying to follow the map to see where you're going in your speech. And this transition statement is a sign that tells them we're stopping the previous point, we're going on to the next point, and that helps them keep the speech organized in their own head as they're listening to the speech. And it also kind of, if you want to use it this way, it can also review what you previously talked about, and it can preview what you're about to talk about. And that can be helpful for helping your audience remember what you talked about and help with some retention there. But the main thing, the number one thing you want to do is signal your audience that you're moving from one point to another. And if you do any of those other things I talked about, bonus points. You're also helping your audience in those other ways. So that's what transition statements are for. Let's go over the introduction real quick. So you have your information set. Your body is done. You are now trying to figure out, how do you get your audience ready to listen to all of that information? Because when you're giving a 5 to 7 minute speech and 5 minutes of that speech is going to be information, that is a lot of information, and you want your audience to be excited and ready to listen to all of that. And if you don't have a good introduction, your audience might get bored or might get distracted. And so even if you have really good information, you want to put a lot of effort into your introduction to make sure that in the 1 minute before you start giving them a ton of information, they are excited and they are ready to learn about what you're going to talk about. And excited isn't necessarily what you always want to be aiming for. If you've got a very emotionally heavy speech, then excitement, you don't need excitement, you need them to be emotionally engaged. But use your introduction effectively in order to get your audience ready to listen to all of the information that you're going to share with them. And the very first step of doing that is the attention getter. When you're giving a speech, the very first words of your mouth shouldn't be, "Hi everyone, I'm Professor Carson," which I know I did that for this video, but forget that. The very first things out of your mouth should be something that grabs your audience's attention. And it has some examples here. I think chapter 8 has some examples of how to do an attention getter. The one I chose is to pose a question. And that question evokes curiosity from the audience that then makes them want to listen to the speech. And so my question was, if you could teleport to anywhere in the world right now, what is the one place that would bring you the most nostalgia? That gets them thinking, that gets them curious, but then that also gets them thinking about nostalgia. What is this guy about to talk about? Is he going to talk about nostalgia? It does connect to the topic a little bit. Nostalgia is the reason I'm talking about Castro Valley, and that'll kind of be apparent in the next few sentences. But the whole point is that you're getting the audience to start thinking and start being curious about what you're about to be talking about. So you've captured the audience's attention. Now you need to show the audience that there's a reason why they should listen to you. And one of the biggest ways to do that, there's 2 ways that are listed here, actually, that you can do. One is establish credibility, so the audience knows they can trust you on the topic. But then the other way is to connect with the audience. Tell the audience why your topic is relevant to them, why it's important to them. This is easier for some other speeches, like if you're doing a persuasive speech about why roads need to be safer in Fairbanks, and you're talking to people that drive in Fairbanks. Use that. That is a perfect way to connect with your audience and show them that this is a relevant speech. For me, I found it a little harder because, like I said, I chose the topic of Castro Valley to make sure nobody steals this speech, but then also many of you live in Fairbanks, and so that might not be as relevant. But I connected to that nostalgia thing again, and I think a lot of you probably have feelings of nostalgia to a place you grew up in, and that's exactly what I did here. Whether you lived in one place growing up or you moved around a lot as a kid, many of us probably have very fond memories of the place we grew up in. That is me connecting to the audience and an experience that the audience probably had, and then I connect that to my topic. For me, that place is Castro Valley, California. And so in doing that, I've connected to the audience while still staying focused on what my speech is about. Next, I establish credibility. I do this in 2 ways. I say that I personally lived in Castro Valley, and that shows that I have personal experience with the topic. And then I also talk about how I have also researched topics such as public services and child development. And that goes to show that not only do I have personal experience in this area, but I'm relying on reliable sources in order to talk about this topic. And so in that way, you know that when I'm giving this speech, I'm a trustworthy source to tell you about this topic. Now, thesis statement we covered. And while it's also important to use this to guide your speech as you're building the speech, I think it's also pretty useful to say it during your speech so that your audience very clearly knows what you're telling them about. And, you don't want to sound robotic when you say it, but this is how I decided to say it, is today I'll share the benefits of growing up in a town like Castro Valley. It's not super technical the way I wrote that. It's very conversational. And if you have a very technical thesis statement, you might want to rewrite it to be a bit conversational, but make sure it's in there. Make sure that your audience has a very clear understanding of what you're talking about. With that, you also need to be previewing your main points. And like I talked about earlier with the transition statements, giving a signpost and imagining that your audience has a map of where your speech is going, that's what this is. This is the map. This is giving your audience a sense of what you're going to be talking about so that during the speech, they don't get lost or confused on what you're talking about. So I say that I'll go over some background information about Castro Valley, how the services offered make Castro Valley a great place for kids, and how the environment of a place like Castro Valley makes it a good place to grow up. And so that way, the audience knows what we're going to talk about in this speech. While I'm talking about background information about Castro Valley, they know that that's just the first part of my speech and that we're going to be talking about other more specific things later on. And when we give those transition points, it also gives the audience a sense of how far done are we in the speech? Are we 2 minutes? Are we a third of the way in, 2/3 of the way in? And kind of helps them maintain some attention throughout the speech. But that's really important because if you don't give the audience that preview, they aren't going to know where they are in the speech. They're going to get lost in the speech and they might lose attention because they don't understand where you are in the speech and also how that part of the speech connects to your overall thesis statement. And lastly, transition statement, just like before where you need to tell your audience when you're ending one main point and moving to another, you need to tell your audience when you're done introducing the topic and when you're starting to give them the chunk of your speech, the main pieces of information that build your speech. So let's start by covering some basic information about Castro Valley. It's simple, but it works. The phrase "let's start" says that we're starting something. We're starting the body of the speech. And I'm also just briefly previewing what I'm about to be talking about so that they know where we're starting, even though I previewed it up here. Doing that in the transitions as well can, again, help put some signposts there to help the audience know where we are. Now jumping down to the conclusion, you want to, again, similarly to the transition statements, tell your audience that you're closing the speech. The way I do it in this one is I call back to the introduction where I talk about nostalgia. And that's one way to do it. The very basic way to do it is you say something like, in conclusion, Castro Valley is a great place to grow up. If you're just starting out in public speaking, that's, it's a very basic way to do it. It's not very creative, but that is what a lot of people start with. And as you get used to that, try to find some more creative ways. The whole point of this is to tell your audience that you're ending the speech, but there's thousands of different ways to do it. Like I said, chapter 8, tons of information on conclusions, but this is the one I chose to do here. Summary of main points. Again, the audience has already heard your speech. This is more about helping them remember what you talked about, because the whole point of giving a speech is not necessarily just to give the speech, but you're also hoping that you leave your audience with something meaningful to use in their everyday life. Or if you're doing a persuasive speech, you're hoping that you leave them with a feeling that they need to change something. And so summarizing your main points reminds them of what are the reasons why we should change something. Or in this case, for an informative speech, what all did we talk about with this interesting topic? And I didn't do this as a complete sentence, and it's completely fine to separate this a little bit because I just think it flows a little bit better. But when I summarize my main points and I restate my thesis statement, I do it all in one sentence. So I talk about my 3 main points, which were basic information about Castro Valley and where it is, the services provided by the community, and the environment created by the infrastructure. I put all 3 of those main points in this summary. Its prime location, the local services that support the community, and the environment created by the town's infrastructure are some of the many benefits of growing up in a place like Castro Valley. And just like the introduction, covered all the same information, but did it in a way that sounds more like I'm wrapping up the speech. And this last part, the concluding remark, it is pretty challenging to get this exactly the way you want it to, but the whole point of this is to leave your audience with something memorable so that the speech as a whole stays in their mind. And I tried to find something that's like a little poetic or a little plays into this nostalgia a little bit more, but as we look to the future of what we'll be doing and where we'll be someday, let's take a moment to appreciate the places we started from that made us who we are today. And it sounds nice, it sounds poetic. I think I probably could have made something a little bit more relevant to my topic, but it talks about the nostalgia again and concludes it in a way that sounds nice and is memorable for the audience. So that is how I use the template to write this speech. You also got your references page. Make sure it's APA 7th format. Make sure that you're putting all the correct information down. And if you need help with APA 7th, plenty of resources online and in the course as well. But overall, that's what your template should look like. I mean, one thing I didn't do here is remove all the highlighted portions, all the yellow portions, but when everything is said and done, this is how the text should look like. Your main points should be complete sentences. Your explanations should support that main point. Your main points, your explanation examples, you're not going to be reading word for word. Like I said, the purpose of this outline is to get you to help you organize all of this information. But when it really comes down to it, you're giving your speech off of note cards, which are meant to help you remember some of the key points of your introduction and conclusion in your body, but you are remembering that it's a memory aid, essentially, your note cards, but you're remembering that as you're giving your speech in a way that's a lot more natural, as you're thinking of what to say while you're saying it, so that you're making eye contact with your audience, you're reacting to your audience, giving you cues on what they're most interested in, or if they're getting bored by something, you might focus on something else in the middle of your speech. But this is the structure to help you practice your speech and help you get your note cards ready. But when you're giving your speech, it really comes down to what feels most natural in the moment and how do you give that information across in a way that makes the most sense for the audience. All right. So with that being said, let's do the speech. So in this next segment, I'm going through the outline. I'm giving my speech, and as I give the speech, I'll be scrolling through the outline, and you'll be able to see how the outline compares to the final speech when everything is given at the end of the day. If you could teleport to anywhere in the world right now, what is the one place that would bring you the most nostalgia? Whether you lived in one place growing up, or you moved around a lot as a kid, many of us probably have very fond memories of a place we grew up in. For me, that place is Castro Valley, California. I personally lived in Castro Valley in the early 2000s from when I was 3 to when I was about 17. While I have my own experience to look back on, I've also researched topics such as public services and child development in suburban areas like Castro Valley. Today, I'll share the benefits of growing up in a town like Castro Valley. I'll go over some background information about Castro Valley, how the services offered make Castro Valley great for kids, and how the environment of a place like Castro Valley makes it a good place to grow up. So let's start by covering some basic information about Castro Valley. Now, Castro Valley is a small area in Northern California, and while the U.S. Census Bureau does designate Castro Valley as an unincorporated area, that's technically all that defines the area as Castro Valley. The area is governed by the county, Alameda County, which is the governing body that also provides some essential services such as police and the bus transit system. And despite being close to some major cities in California, Castro Valley isn't too crowded. According to the Census Bureau, Castro Valley has a population density of less than 4,000 people per square mile, which is why many regard it as a suburban area. In fact, Yemen Cedar, in a 2006 study I'll discuss later, called it, quote, one of the fastest growing suburban communities in Northern California, end quote. Much of this growth can likely be attributed to the growth of the greater Bay Area as well, with major cities such as San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose driving economic growth in the region. Now that we know some basic information about Castro Valley, let's talk about how the services make it a great place for kids to grow up in. Growing up in Castro Valley, I found it really easy to get around. I could take a bus to school or the library, and through the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, or BART, I could take a BART train from my local BART station all the way to San Francisco for a big event, or all the way to San Jose to go to the hospital, or all the way to Oakland to catch a baseball game at the Oakland Coliseum. But don't just take my word for it. In 2006, Yim and Cedar conducted a study on the transit services provided to Castro Valley residents. And as part of their background information in that study, they found that as regional economies grew in the Bay Area over the past few decades, residents have increasingly relied on Castro Valley's BART station as well as its AC transit bus stations. While these services make it easy to get out of Castro Valley, there are still many educational services offered locally. Chelsea Roos, a librarian at the Castro Valley Library, describes in her 2020 article many of the services offered by the library, including reading clubs and organizations, events and programs, and volunteer programs that service the community both at the library itself and at local schools. Not only do services such as public transportation, schools, and libraries make Castro Valley great for kids, the suburban environment offered by an area like Castro Valley are great for kids as well. When I was in middle school and high school, part of my commute to school involved walking about a mile through our town's main boulevard, and it had infrastructure such as bike lanes, large sidewalks, and crosswalks that were great for pedestrian safety. I believe that partially due to this infrastructure, a lot of kids like myself were trusted to be able to safely walk alone during the day, and research shows that this is great for childhood cognitive development. A 2017 study by Bruce Appleyard in the Journal of Transport and Health found that independent and active travel may improve children's spatial knowledge development, and on the other hand, inadequate pedestrian infrastructure limits children's progression for spatial knowledge. So pedestrian infrastructure, like those used in Castro Valley's sidewalks, are not just safer for the community, but they also support cognitive development for children in the community through the experience of active and independent travel. Like I said, many of us have a place in our memory that brings us a lot of nostalgia, and I hope I've been able to share with you a little bit of what makes Castro Valley special. Its prime location, the local services that support the community, and the environment created by the town's infrastructure are some of the many benefits of growing up in a place like Castro Valley. So as we look to the future of what we'll be doing and where we'll be someday, let's take a moment to appreciate the places we started from that made us who we are today.